16 years. That is how long the crown of France sat on the head of a boy who would grow into a man who would lose it all, while across the channel another king watched, waited, and planned. But that number, 16, is only where the deception begins. Because the truth about this war is that it did not start with a battle, or a betrayal, or even a single dramatic moment of defiance. It started with a family tree, a legal loophole, and a question that would take 4 generations to answer. And the answer, when it finally came, was written not in ink, but in the mud of a field, where thousands of men would sink, drown, and die without ever seeing the face of the enemy who killed them. You have heard the name your whole life, the 100 Years' War. It sits in your memory next to Joan of Arc and the longbow and the idea that England and France just sort of fought for a really long time until eventually one of them gave up. That is what the textbooks give you. A tidy label, a few famous battles, and a sense that it all makes sense if you do not look too closely. But here is what nobody tells you. Here is what the simplified story cannot hold. This war did not last 100 years. It lasted 116 years, which means every person born in England or France during that entire span was born into a world where the war existed before them and would likely exist after them. Think about what that does to a human being. You plant a field knowing soldiers may burn it. You marry knowing your husband may never come home. You raise children knowing they will be asked to fight in a conflict that began before your grandfather was born. This is not a war in the modern sense, not a national struggle with clear borders and defined enemies. This is something older, stranger, and far more personal. It is a feud between 2 royal families that grew so large it swallowed 2 entire kingdoms, and it is the single greatest example of how the petty ambitions of a few can rewrite the lives of millions. And the man who set it all in motion, the man whose name history remembers as the aggressor, was not a monster and not a hero. He was a king who simply believed he had been robbed. His name was Edward III, and in 1337 he made a claim that would echo through the centuries. He said the crown of France belonged to him, not through conquest, not through strength, but through blood, through a mother whose lineage gave him a better claim than the man currently sitting on the French throne. That man was Philip VI, and he was not about to hand over his kingdom because some English upstart pointed at a family tree. So Edward did what kings do when they want something that someone else refuses to give. He gathered his nobles, he summoned his parliament, and he began to plan for war. But here is the part they leave out, the part that makes this story so much bigger than a simple territorial dispute. The war was never really about the crown. The crown was the excuse, the banner, the noble cause that gave men permission to do what they already wanted to do. What they really wanted was the wealth of France, the trade routes, the fertile lands, the ports that controlled the flow of goods between the Mediterranean and the North Sea. And what they feared was each other. Because a France united under a strong king was a direct threat to English ambitions, and an England that could project power across the Channel was a nightmare for the French. This was not a clash of civilizations or a holy mission. It was 2 nations locked in a death grip over money, land, and the question of who got to be the big dog in Western Europe. And that is a much harder story to tell, because it does not fit neatly into the narrative of heroic kings and noble knights. That shift from a noble crusade to a raw fight over trade routes and farmlands is the part most history books skip. Subscribe so you do not miss these deeper layers when we tear into the next chapter of this war. Drop the word trade in the comments if you already felt the crown was just the excuse. But before we get to the mud and the blood and the fire, we have to talk about something else entirely. We have to talk about the machinery that made this war possible. Because wars do not happen just because kings want them. Wars happen because someone writes the letters, secures the loans, convinces the nobles, and rallies the people. In 1338, a full year after Edward made his claim, this machinery was still being assembled. And on the southeastern coast of England, in the ports where ships loaded wool and wine and weapons, there was a man who did not appear in any royal chronicle, whose name would not make it into the history books, but who played a role in this story nonetheless. His name was Peter Caceres, and he was a merchant, an Aragonese trader who had built his business in the bustling ports of England. He was not a lord, not a knight, not a bishop. He was a man who moved goods, gathered information, and knew how to talk to people. And in that year of 1338, between the months of March and May, he found himself in a position that would seem absurd if you did not understand how medieval politics actually worked. He presented a plan to King Edward and his council, not a military strategy, not a call to arms, but a council, a proposal built on information he had gathered from the docks, the taverns, the merchants who traveled between kingdoms. He told the king what he had heard about alliances, about who could be trusted, about the shifting loyalties of princes and dukes across the channel. Now you might be thinking, why would a king listen to a merchant? Why would the fate of nations hinge on the reports of a man who sold cloth and wine for a living? And that is exactly the kind of assumption that makes people misunderstand this entire war. Because the truth is, medieval kings were desperate for information. They had no newspapers, no telegraphs, no intelligence agencies. They had rumors, travelers' tales, and the word of men who had been places and seen things. And when you are planning to invade a country that is separated from you by water, when you are trying to secure alliances with dukes and counts who could go either way, the information a merchant brings can be worth more than a regiment of soldiers. Caceres did not fight in the war, but he helped make it possible, one piece of intelligence at a time. This is the story they do not tell you in school. The 100 Years' War was not just a war of arrows and armor, of heroic charges and glorious victories. It was a war of paperwork, of loans and treaties, of spies and merchants, and men who saw an opportunity to make a fortune from the suffering of nations. And once you understand that, once you see the machinery behind the battles, you start to realize that this conflict was not an accident of history. It was a choice. A series of choices made by men who believed they could control the fire they were lighting, and they were all wrong. Because here is what no one predicted in 1337. No one could have foreseen that this war would outlast its instigator, that Edward III would die before it ended, his claim to the French crown still unresolved, his son dead of dysentery before him, the English throne passed to a child who would grow up to lose everything his father had won. And no one could have predicted that the French would eventually rally around a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, that she would lead armies and crown a king and then be burned alive by her enemies. But those stories come later. Right now, in the early years, the war was just beginning, and no one knew how long it would last. So, let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before we continue. If you were a peasant living in northern France in the year 1340, and you heard that the English king had claimed your crown, that armies were gathering, that your fields and villages might become a battleground, what would you do? Would you stay and hope the war passed you by? Would you flee and lose everything you owned? Or would you pick up whatever weapon you could find and join a fight that had nothing to do with you? Because that is the reality of this war. That is the human cost that the history books gloss over. The kings played their chess game with real people as the pieces, and the peasants, the farmers, the women and children who just wanted to live their lives, they were the ones who paid the price. Standing in that peasant's muddy shoes, you get what the textbooks hide. This was never about crowns. It was about survival. If you're ready to stop learning history and start living it, subscribe to this channel so we can walk through every siege, every betrayal, and every burning village together. And for those of you who want the real story, the one textbooks are too scared to print, drop the word mud in the comments if you felt the weight of that choice, the one between fleeing and fighting. That is the loop I opened at the beginning, the one about the 16 years and the family tree and the crown that sat on the wrong head. And I am going to keep that loop open, because the answer to how this war really started is not a simple one, and it will take us through the burning villages and the mud-soaked fields to understand it. But before we go deeper into the horror, let me tell you about the one thing that made everything different, the one piece of technology that changed the rules of war forever and gave the English an advantage they would hold for over a century. It was not a siege engine, not a new kind of armor, not a brilliant general. It was a simple weapon made of wood and string, and it could punch through a knight's armor from 100 yards away as easily as a needle through cloth. And it was about to rewrite the history of Europe, the longbow. You have heard of it, of course, but what you have not heard is how it actually worked. What it felt like to face a wall of arrows coming at you like rain. What it took to be one of the men who drew that bow and held it and shot it until your fingers bled and your back screamed. It was not a weapon for the weak. It took years to master, required enormous physical strength, and could be fired so rapidly that a skilled archer could loose a dozen arrows in a minute. And when thousands of those arrows filled the sky at once, they did not just kill. They broke entire armies, shattered morale, turned knights in shining armor into so much scrap metal on the ground. This was the weapon that would define the early victories of the war, and it was made possible by something even simpler than the bow itself. The arrow. A steel tip, a wooden shaft, fletched with goose feathers. It sounds so simple, so basic, and yet the English needed millions of them. Every archer carried a sheaf of arrows, and every battle consumed them by the thousands. The logistics of producing, transporting, and distributing these arrows was a monumental undertaking that required the entire English economy to support it. And this is where the war stops being about knights and starts being about something much bigger, because a war that lasts for generations is not sustained by heroism. It is sustained by plows and forges, by farmers growing flax for bowstrings, by artisans shaping arrowheads, by merchants shipping cargo across the channel. It is a war of production, of supply chains, of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs so that extraordinary violence can continue. And that is what I want you to hold on to as we move through this story. The 100 Years' War is not a single narrative, not a simple tale of good versus evil, not a glorious chapter in the history of either nation. It is a sprawling, chaotic, brutal mess of competing interests and human suffering, a conflict that reshaped two countries, and for no better reason than that a handful of men believed they were entitled to something that someone else had. And if you think you know how this story goes, if you think you know who won and why, I'm going to show you how wrong that simple version really is. Because the war did not end with a treaty, did not end with a decisive battle, did not end with a clear victory for either side. It ended because both countries were finally too exhausted to keep fighting, because the cost had become too great to bear. But that is the ending, and we have a long way to go before we get there. We have to walk through the burning fields of France, stand in the rain at Agincourt, watch a teenage girl lead an army, and be abandoned by the king she crowned. We have to understand how a conflict that started with a family tree became a cradle of national identity, how the English and the French learned to hate each other as nations, not just as subjects of rival kings. And we have to ask ourselves, what does it say about us, about human nature, that we can fight for so long over so little, that we can burn and kill and die for a crown that only one person can wear? That is the question this war asks, and it is a question that is still being asked today. In every conflict, in every border dispute, in every argument about who deserves what and why. So stay with me as we descend into this story. Stay with me as we peel back the layers of myth and legend and find the human truth beneath. Because you have been told this was a war between kings, a simple struggle for power. But the reality The thing that will make you see history differently from now on is that it was a war of choices, a war of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, a war that built the world you live in today. And you are about to find out just how much of that world was shaped by mud, blood, and the sheer stubborn refusal of two nations to back down. This is the 100 Years' War, and it is bigger, messier, and more brutally human than you ever imagined. The first crack in the simple story comes when you realize that the war was not one war, but a series of wars, separated by uneasy truces and broken treaties, each one its own tragedy, with its own causes and its own consequences. Historians divide it into phases, and each phase has its own character, its own turning points, its own heroes and villains. The Edwardian phase, named for the king who started it all, was dominated by the English cavalry and the longbow, by the crushing victories at Crécy and Poitiers. The Caroline phase, a generation later, saw the French fight back under better leadership, pushing the English back and reclaiming much of what had been lost. And then there was the Lancastrian phase, made famous by Henry V and Agincourt, by the English conquest of Normandy and the French counterattack that drove them out once and for all. If those phases left you wondering which moment truly broke the war wide open, you are not alone. Subscribe to this channel because we are going to walk you through every siege, betrayal, and backroom deal the textbooks skip over. Tell me in the comments, was it Crécy, Poitiers, or Agincourt that you think decided everything? And why? Because the deeper you dig, the more those neat chapters start to blur. But do not let those clean divisions fool you. The war did not proceed in neat chapters. It was chaos, punctuated by periods of peace that always felt temporary, negotiations that always broke down, alliances that shifted with the wind. Alliances, that is another thing that makes this war so hard to simplify. The French allied with the Scots, hoping to distract the English with attacks from the north. The English allied with the Burgundians, splitting France against itself from within. At various points, the war involved not just England and France, but also Scotland, Castile, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, and anyone else with a grudge or a trade route to protect. And these alliances were not based on ideology or national interest as we understand it. They were personal, dynastic, built on marriages and bribes and promises that meant as much as the paper they were written on. And speaking of promises, let me tell you about the one that mattered most, the one that would shape the entire course of the war. It is the promise of allegiance, the feudal oath that bound every noble to their lord, and every lord to their king. In theory, this oath was sacred, unbreakable, a covenant between man and God. In practice, it was a tool, a weapon, a thing to be wielded when useful and discarded when inconvenient. The Dukes of Normandy, of Aquitaine, of Burgundy, these men swore fealty to the French crown, and yet they spent much of the war maneuvering for their own advantage, switching sides when the price was right, betraying their king without a second thought. And on the English side, the same thing happened. The powerful earls and barons who fought for Edward III did not do so out of loyalty alone. They did it because they were promised land, wealth, titles, and they knew that a king who won was a king who could reward his followers with the spoils of conquest. So when you hear the word chivalry, when you see the romantic paintings of knights in shining armor and ladies in towers, remember what it really meant. Chivalry was a code, yes, but it was a code that was broken constantly, a veneer of honor over a reality of pragmatism and self-interest. Knights who swore to protect the weak preyed on peasants. Kings who claimed to fight for justice burned villages and slaughtered civilians. The chroniclers who recorded these events were paid by the powerful, and their accounts are full of bias and propaganda. And the men who were doing the actual fighting, the archers and the men-at-arms and the common soldiers, they were not fighting for honor or glory or the love of their king. They were fighting because they had to, because they were levied and forced, because it was better than starving, because they had no choice at all. That is the real story of this war, and it is not a pleasant one. It is a story of exploitation, of the powerful using the powerless as fuel for their ambitions, of generations consumed by a conflict that no one could win and no one could stop. But it is also a story of resilience, of people who endured terrible hardship and somehow carried on, of a civilization that was scarred but not destroyed by the violence that surrounded it. And if you can hold both of those truths in your mind at once, if you can see the horror and the humanity without flinching, then you are ready to understand what happened next. Because the war was about to take a turn that nobody could have predicted, and the consequences of that turn would echo all the way to the present. But that is a story for later. For now, we have to go back to the beginning, to the mud and the rain, and the first great test of arms between these two kingdoms, to the moment when the world first learned that the longbow had changed everything.